Hey everybody, welcome to week 3 of the course, Ancient Greek Thoughts. Good to be with you again. Today we take a turn. So far, we have been focused on the pre-Socratics, the Milesians, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Pythagoras, the pluralists, this whole chart. We'll put that up on the screen again in a moment. Today we're moving into the last part of that chart, the Sophists and Socrates. Two distinct groups that move philosophy out of the area of physics, speculation about what exists, and toward what Guthrie calls humanism, right? A concern with everyday human life and especially with ethics. And that's really going to be the focus of the remainder of our time in the course, both in all three, in Socrates, in Plato, and in Aristotle. So let's lay a good foundation for that today and make sure we're clear on who this Socrates guy is. So let's get started. All right. Here we have some statues. Here's our favorite chart. Now remember, we have moved through here what? Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, the Milesians. They ask that initial question. What is everything made of? We move from there to Heraclitus, Parmenides in green, right? What are they doing? They're talking about change in Heraclitus, and we're talking about constancy or oneness in Parmenides. In a reaction against, especially Parmenides, you get the pluralists, right? Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and Democritus are the three that we focused on. And from their point of view, everything that is composed of certain elements, right? And each of those elements, whether it's an atom or the four elements, you remember our coverage last week, is itself unchanging. But they're basically working in the shadow of Parmenides, right? They're trying to solve problems suggested by his thought. When we get on to the Sophists and to Socrates, we're turning, though, as I said, toward human concerns. So the Sophists are not asking questions, and Socrates is not asking questions about the nature of reality. It is a new day in our course and in Greek thought. Let's see what Guthrie has to say about this. He has a sure hand as a commentator, so I encourage you to read closely his chapter. The physical speculations of these thinkers, people just didn't know what to do with them, right? I mean, is it air? Is it water? Man, I got to pay my bills, right? Help me know how to live my life. Don't answer abstract questions to which I didn't even, need an answer. As Guthrie puts it, this is a revolt of common sense against the remoteness and incomprehensibility of the world as the physicists presented it. And their physicist doesn't mean, modern physics. It means the work of these earlier figures. And for a moment, as Guthrie said, people could and did turn their back on these physical speculations. Now, to emphasize, that's not saying that those things were unimportant or foolish or bad. It was just a desire for a different kind of question to be addressed. There were other reasons for this too, and the standard one, of course, is war. When there is a conflict, as there was in Athens, they were in a terrible war starting in 431 BCE, lasting for decades. There was simply no longer the leisure to ask questions about, the ultimate nature of reality. People became more practical in their focus. Also, in the city of Athens, the city-state, you'll be aware that democracy was the form of government, and there was an interest on the part of many to become better and more effective in that system. How can I persuade people to adopt my point of view, right? Because there's going to be a vote, and they have to, if I want to get something done, right, they have to agree with me, my fellow citizens do. So this choice between Parmenides and the pluralists, again, it's unpalatable. It just gets set aside, and we move toward these new concerns. Now, the representative group addressing this change were the Sophists. And this is a particular movement within Greek thought at this time. It comes from the word Sophistes, meaning practitioners of wisdom, right? They are itinerant teachers. And what does this mean? They're not at a college or at a school. They travel from place to place, and they would actually get people to pay them, basically tuition, right? College without an administration, pay them to teach them. So they're kind of tutors, right? I mean, wealthy families might say, hey, sophist, right? Come educate my son, most likely, so that he can be more effective in the assembly when he's giving speeches, right? I want him to be able to ascend the ladder of influence in Athenian society. The focus of these figures, the sophists, was practical through and through. They desired to cultivate excellence. Arete is the Greek word for this. Excellence in argument and rhetoric. So, argument has to do with the content of what you're saying. Is it logical? Do all the claims follow, right? And rhetoric has to do with how you deliver that argument. Are you doing it in a way that is going to get people's attention, make them sympathetic to you, help them to understand your claim? Also, characteristic of the sophists was what we call skepticism. And later on, there was actually a movement in philosophy in Greece and Rome known as the skeptics. Here we're talking about the broad idea of being skeptical of things, right? They had a mistrust in the possibility, especially of absolute knowledge. Right? Now remember, Pythagoras, Parmenides, even Heraclitus in his way, talking about the logos, right? All these figures that we've looked at, they were confident that you could answer the question, right? What is everything made of? What is the nature of reality? The sophists are introducing what looks to our eye today as a very modern kind of challenge of that idea. Basically, how do you know that? How do you know that the world is made of water, or that it's the apeiron, an Anaximander? What makes you feel so confident that you can say that? And the sophists don't worry about questions of ultimate truth. And this is why Socrates will criticize them. They're not interested in truth. They're interested in getting the argument across, landing the argument, winning the case, getting the votes, right? So, I mean, think about figures. I mean, there are many wonderful people who work in the field of law, right? But we are aware of this kind of cultural stereotype of a lawyer who will get you the result you want, right? Regardless of whether you're guilty or innocent or whatever else, they're able to make the case. That's what the sophists effectively were doing. They based this on some deep speculations about the nature of reality. If something, for example, is hot or cold, right? It's hot or cold to our touch. Certainly, we know when something is hot or cold, and generally, as people, we can agree on that. But isn't this based on our own perception, right? I mean, if you're from Quebec, maybe you think 10 degrees below zero it's not so bad in the winter, right? But if you're from New Haven, it's a little cold, right? So we have different perspectives on that. What they propose, the sophists, is, well, if that's true in the case of what would later be called these secondary qualities, I mean, heat and cold, color, opinions in matters of taste, like food and art. Okay, we disagree about all those things. Why is that not also the case when it comes to justice, right and wrong, the good life, right? Why should there be one answer to the question, what is the good life? Shouldn't there be as many answers potentially as there are people asking the question? This is what the Sophists held. And it's a view very familiar, I think, on our landscape today. One of these sophists, Gorgias, about whom we won't say much, but Plato wrote a dialogue under that title. He wrote a book, Gorgias, kind of a snarky book. Um, he gave the name On Nature or the Non-Existent. And in it, he set out to prove three things. Here are the three things. One, nothing exists. Two, if anything did exist, we couldn't know it existed. Three, if we could know anything, we could not tell anybody. We could not communicate it to our neighbor. His title there, as Guthrie points out, is a play on a book by one of the earlier philosophers we looked at, On Nature or the Existent, right? So, I mean, what the aim is there to answer that question. What is everything made of? Right? But Gorgias is basically saying, a little tongue-in-cheek almost, come on, you don't know that. You can't know that. And if you did know it, you couldn't convey it to anyone else. Skepticism is the view of these sophists. Here's one individual sophist who is probably the best known. Plato also has a dialogue where Socrates engages with him. His name is Protagoras. Protagoras was famous for holding what we today would call an agnosticism about religion. In Greek, the word gnosis means knowledge. Therefore, agnosis, agnostic, means without knowledge. Like asexual reproduction is reproduction without sexual intercourse. So agnosticism is a claim that you do not have knowledge. That fits with what we were just saying about Gorgias. Protagoras maintains, he's famous for this line, man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure of all things. Reality, how we conceive of it through science, how we express our experience of it through art, this is all based on my perspective. Right? You have your perspective, I have my perspective, and all of our perspectives are human. They're limited, right? And so our knowledge always is relative to that human identity. We would say today, this is the truth for you and the truth for me. Or if we go further, your truth and my truth, right? For Protagoras, truth is relative. There's no universal truth, absolute truth. And no one's truth is truer than anyone else's, although some accounts might be more useful. Right? So maybe you have a truth that enables you to live a flourishing life and be happy and content and have a nice family and all the rest. Maybe I have a truth that doesn't enable me to do that. Well, we'd say, okay, we don't know which one of those is true, but we sure know that you look happier than me, right? And so this is a standard of truth that is, again, familiar today, but against which Socrates would argue. Protagoras in a social mode, so we've been talking about kind of individual knowledge. He also develops, as Guthrie points out, on the collective level, an early version of what we would today call a social contract, right? So society isn't there because God made it that way, because nature made it that way, because it was given to us. No, society is there because we individually have agreed to basically sign a contract. Like when you lease an apartment or something, right? You sign the lease, the terms of the lease, and if those terms are violated, you can break it up. So that's where Protagoras goes in his thinking on social issues. But here's the guy, Ecce homo, behold the man, Socrates. He devoted his life to challenging the views that we have been describing, the views attributed to the sophist. He holds everything that exists has a certain telos. It's a Greek word meaning a purpose or an end, right? Everything has a certain nature. And according to that nature, we can know what we should do with that thing, how we should develop that thing. It's not just coming out of our own head. It's not just, man is the measure of all things. We made it all up. No, Socrates thinks reality actually does make a claim on us, right? We're beholden to reality, and we can know more about reality. We have to go through a certain process to do it, but we can have knowledge. Thus, to talk about excellence, right? I want to be an excellent arguer. Great. In order to do that, we need to know and be confident in the truth of what we're saying. Right? It's not just a matter of making the best argument to win the case and get the decision you want. It's a matter of arguing in a way that will bring out truth. We achieve this excellence, he thinks, by developing a certain attitude of mind. Yes, we're always questioning. Yes, we know that we don't know, right? There's a certain humility in what Socrates is saying. He's not like the earlier thinkers saying, I simply know the reality. But he's different from the sophists because he thinks we can get there, right? We're not there yet. We can get there if we go through this process. Socrates and Plato, who's coming next, They both thought that if you sought knowledge in that way, you asked the questions, right? You engaged in that inquiry, that you would develop virtue, right? If you could learn the truth, learn how reality is put together, how society is put together, how your soul is put together, right? You would come to understand how you should live. So the question is then, how do you get the knowledge so that you can get the virtue, so that you can live well? So it's practical in its own way. Two ways of doing this for Socrates and also for Plato. Plato is the student of Socrates. They look to inductive argument, so they often move from particular example to particular example, right? And then from those particular examples, they try and derive a common basis, right? What is the general definition of justice, truth, beauty, goodness? Right? What is a general definition that we can derive from all of these particular examples? So there is something empirical in what they're doing. They are looking at actual cases, right? But they're doing so in order to derive big kind of general definitions of things. Last one on Socrates here, a couple more things. We'll go on to the Euthyphro, which is our main task for today. Socrates is actually executed by the city of Athens. It's a famous moment, history of philosophy, history of Western culture. He's charged with impiety, that is, not believing in the gods or honoring the gods, and corruption of the youth, basically for going around and asking a bunch of questions that gets everybody wrangled up, right? Rather than accepting the received social opinions. He chooses, Socrates, famously, to stay in Athens and to face his death sentence. He himself takes the poison called hemlock, it's a certain kind of poison, and drinks it in a famous moment. He is offered an opportunity to escape and declines, and we'll be looking at that a bit next week when we look at some of his other dialogues. What Plato does after the death of Socrates is carry on his legacy and go further too. He develops that legacy, adding to it in ways that, as we'll see, are pretty distinctive. Let's wrap up our time here by looking at the Euthyphro. This is the key dialogue for us this week, and the one about which you've been invited to write in your essay. This is the first of 4 dialogues on the trial and death of Socrates. That's a phrase that is in circulation. They tell of the several weeks, really about a month and a half, from the time Socrates was brought up on charges to the time that he was executed. The Euthyphro begins before his trial, and it kind of sets the stage for those 4 dialogues. Plato wrote these dialogues, and in doing so, he had a few aims. One was that he wanted to vindicate Socrates from the charge of impiety. That's especially his aim in the Euthyphro. Y'all say Socrates didn't believe in the gods. Well, you know what? Let me give you a whole dialogue on him talking about the gods, and I'll show you that he did in fact honor the gods. Second, Plato wants to criticize the traditional idea of piety in Greek thought. And here we see a link with those Milesians from the beginning, right? They're questioning received opinion, Plato and as much as Thales. Thales is, sure, there are all kinds of religious beliefs about, where the world came from. He's not satisfied with that. He wants to look deeper. Same thing with Plato. He wants to take that kind of, taken for granted beliefs about religion, basically, and question them. And finally, he wants to show that what Socrates is doing, his method, his beliefs, is actually the real piety, right? Piety is not just blindly believing in the gods, but engaging in the activity that Socrates was engaging in. And what was that activity? Well, thank you, Google Images. We have this lovely picture of Socrates that someone has produced. In fact, Lin Shen seems to have produced this, so thank you to Lin Shen. The Socratic Method. If you've probably heard of this, right? This is used today. It's what I try to do in my classes. What do? First, you ask a challenging, open-ended question, something like, what is justice? Or let's take, what is piety? given that that's the concern of the Euthyphro, the dialogue called the Euthyphro. Second, you build on that first question by asking why. Okay, so what is piety, Euthyphro? Euthyphro says this. Socrates says, oh, really? Maybe so, but why? Right? Okay, so you come up with different ideas. You question your ideas. Is this a good definition? Right? And usually you come out and you think, no, there's something lacking in this definition. Okay, back to the drawing board. Let's answer the question again. Let's try a different response. Back and forth, back and forth. You repeat these steps to get closer to a better solution. And it's good that you ask people with different perspectives. Why? Different perspectives, you can test out different ideas and kind of cover the field to see that you're taking into consideration all possible options. Now, the key part here is getting closer to a better solution. The Sophists are also going back and forth and arguing, but they don't believe that they're getting closer to the solution. Right? They don't think there is a solution. They just think there are more and less useful opinions. Socrates does. He does think that there's a fact of the matter, there's a truth that we can get at, and he wants us to do so. Let's talk about the form of the dialogue for a minute in Plato. We're going to look at the Euthyphro in a second, but we need to know what we're looking at. Plato writes pretty exclusively in the dialogue form. What does he want to do? He wants to express these complex philosophical ideas in a way that stimulates original thinking on your part and on my part, on the part of the reader. Because you could read a book, some philosopher saying this and that. Okay, that's very nice, right? And you get some information. How sweet. Right? But it's not about getting information. It's about you yourself engaging in the process, because only by doing that Socratic method, engaging in that process, can you actually come closer to truth. Otherwise, you're just accepting a bunch of opinions from other people. Plato thinks that's not very valuable. Also, the dialogues help to show connections between different ideas in a way that would be hard in a book, or would be less engaging in the form of we call it a monograph or an essay or something like that. Most of these dialogues are what we call aporetic. Port in Latin would be a door or a way, right? So just like with agnosis, agnosticism, aporetic means there is no way forward. No, that's exciting, right? But what does that mean? You get to the end of these dialogues, and there's no gotcha moment. There's no like big reveal like, hey, there's piety, right? There is no final answer. There's only the process of questioning. And this is why sometimes you take a class in philosophy in college, and you think, well, it's just a bunch of questions. Tell me what I need to know. Reasonable. But that's not what Plato's about, or Socrates, or us at Albertus, right? We want to engage you in the process of questioning, because it's in that process, it's in that discipline that truth actually comes to be found. Sidebar, in the side of the text, all the text we'll be reading, you'll see some numbers like 1098b or 1024c, something like this. Those are called Stephanus numbers. They're named after a printer who printed an early edition of this. And kind of like with the Bible, with chapters and verses, here with the Stephanus numbers is just a universal way of referring to a part of the text, even if the translation is different. All right, just a little bit about the argument, specifically the argument of the Euthyphro. Basically, you got two characters, Socrates, Euthyphro. Euthyphro is bringing a charge against his father. His father was complicit somehow in the death of a slave. Euthyphro is a very pious person. He thinks this is wrong. He is charging his father with murder. It's kind of a remarkable thing to do, right? Socrates says, Euthyphro, that's a kind of remarkable thing to do. You must be really confident that what you're doing is right. And Euthyphro says, oh, yes, of course, I'm very, very knowledgeable about piety. And Socrates says, piety, huh? Funny you should mention that. I am being charged with impiety. Maybe, Euthyphro, you could help me to understand piety. And if I had a definition, I, Socrates, could, I could win my trial. Right? So Socrates is being a little tongue-in-cheek, right? I don't think he really thinks that Euthyphro knows what piety is, but this is his method, right? Ask the general question, inquire, inquire, inquire. So, question is posed, 5D. What is piety? Okay. A few definitions, 4 definitions are covered. 4, get all 4 fingers in there. 1, Euthyphro begins, well, piety is just what I'm doing right now. I'm bringing charges of murder against my father. Who cares if it's my father? It's all about justice, says Euthyphro. Now, why is this not an acceptable definition? Why do they have to go on to number 2? A few things. Number 1, it doesn't have the proper form. It's not a general definition of piety. It's just an example of piety. That's great to start from, but it's not a conclusion. The aim is to find out what piety is in the sense of getting a definition of piety as one thing, right? If not just a bunch of examples. That's your raw material. From there, again, you want to go to that common basis. And this common basis should be a model. And that's what Socrates wants. He wants a model against which all cases can be judged. So, practically speaking, he's on trial for impiety. If he has a definition of piety, getting a little tongue in cheek, right? If he has a definition of piety, then he can say to his accusers, aha, I know what piety is. It's this, right? And I'm therefore not impious. Well, they have to move on, however, to a second definition, or not however, for all the reasons I just stated. So, second definition, Euthyphro answers, piety is what is dear to or loved by the gods. Right? Of course, in ancient Greece, you have many gods. Great. Euthyphro, but Socrates, that is not happy with this definition. And why? Well, he gives reasons, because maybe some of the gods love something and some of the gods don't love something. And so, like, how do you know, what is beloved by the gods, Euthyphro? ... question mark, leading to definition 3. Okay, piety is what all of the gods love, right? Well, that seems to resolve that. But then we can go a bit deeper still. So now we have all of the gods loving something. You say, okay, well, do that thing. That's the pious thing, right? But then Socrates introduces what is called the Euthyphro dilemma, right? And this is a kind of philosophical problem, we would say, expressed in the dialogue, and it will be the topic of your essay. The dilemma is basically this. Do the gods love something? So we're talking about all the gods, right? Do they love it because it is pious? Good, right? Or is it pious simply because they love it? This is the key point in the lecture. So play that again. Do they love it because it is pious? Or is it pious because they love it? This comes down to this. Which comes first? God or morality? Or what is right, right? Because if what is right comes first, let's go on to the next slide here. Yeah, here we go. Let's identify this a bit more using this image, and then I'll explain it. So, top of the image, and thank you to whomever produced this. Either God commands something because it is right, or something is right because God commands it. Okay. On the left, if God commands something because it is right, then there's a standard of rightness independent of God. That's a bit of a problem, right? I mean, I thought God created the world. I thought God created everything. Let's put this in a Christian register, right? If God created everything, well, then what's this thing that's more important than God, that's prior to God? This thing that God is like beholden to, right? That's a strange notion. Second, if something is right because God commands it, and that's it, right? Then rightness is purely arbitrary. God could command anything, right? God wakes up on a Tuesday. I think I'll strike this person with lightning, and I think I'll make, the gravitational constant different, and I think I'll make this mountain float up into the sky, or, there's no criterion at all. God just does whatever he wants. So this is what you call a dilemma. And I think we have our image here. A dilemma, the two horns of the dilemma, right? Something that's bad and something that's equally bad. Okay, well, what's bad? Well, that you have this unknown standard somehow that God is beholden to, and therefore God is not really God, right? And the other one is God is like so much God, he just does whatever he wants. I mean, you can't know what God is going to do. Neither of those views are seen by Socrates or many people to be acceptable. right? And so what do you do? I mean, the horns of a dilemma, the tough thing is, if you avoid one, you're stuck on the other one. And if you avoid the other one, you're stuck on the one, right? That's what makes it a dilemma. Here's our conclusion on the Euthyphro. They come down to a final definition. Piety is the part of justice concerned with care of the gods. So they kind of get stuck on the dilemma. They don't really resolve it, right? But then they play on this notion of what it means to care for, or the care of the gods. Well, does it mean like you're tending horses or sheep or livestock? Well, that's a bit silly. I mean, the gods don't need us to take care of them as though they're sheep, right? Does care mean a kind of slave's service to the master, some kind of service industry thing? Well, it seems a bit silly to think that God or the gods, need us to take care of them. I mean, they're the gods, right? They should have that. Or does care of mean, how to sacrifice and pray, a kind of trade with the gods, right? So I'm going to do this. The gods like it. They're like, that's cool. I'll give you a good life, going back and forth. Okay, but then that kind of puts us back at the beginning with, the definitions 2 and 3. That is, do the gods love something because it's pious, or is it pious because they love it? Um, Short story. There's a big dilemma here. Gets kind of stuck, in the middle of the dialogue, and there's no final resolution. And as you see at the end of the dialogue, Socrates goes away saying like, Euthyphro, I don't know how helpful that was. I don't think we actually got a definition out of that, right? Here's a little cartoon for you. But Euthyphro, you have only gone around in a circle and have not explained piety at all, says Socrates. Excuse me, I've got to go now, says Euthyphro. He's out of here. Why? Because he knows he doesn't know. He's been a bit exposed. Like, he was talking a big game about piety. He was even bringing charges of murder against his own father. But, he doesn't even have an ability to explain what piety means. All right, so let's wrap this up, guys. Today we've moved from that early stuff about physics, basically, what is the world made of, all the way up to Socrates. We've introduced the Sophists, whom he's arguing against. We've introduced Socrates himself and his Socratic method of questioning, expressed by Plato in his dialogues. And we've looked at the dialogue, the Euthyphro, and specifically this question of which comes first, right? Piety or the gods? Who determines what is right? Some standard in itself, or the simple whim of God? On that question of the Euthyphro dilemma, I encourage you to engage in the forum about that. Check out Guthrie, because he has a good description of it. And make sure to listen a couple times to the portion of the lecture devoted to that, because that's going to be our main kind of focus, our case study, as it were, of this aporetic, dialogical method of Socrates. So thank you very much, and I will see you next week.